Hello and welcome back to the Karma Stories podcast. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today I have 4 stories for you from the Malicious Compliance subreddit. The Karma Stories podcast is published to all major podcasting platforms, and you can also read along on YouTube under our @Karma Stories podcast handle. Alright, on to the stories, let's jump right in. This story comes to us from Petite Peach Pep. I should talk to HR about leave if I'm legitimately having trouble at work 1 week before my due date? Sure thing, boss. This happened last year. I, female 31, was 1 week away from my due date and was working full-time in a school administration position. At this time, I had the capability to work from home if needed, if I was too sick to come into work, catch up on extra work, unable to secure daycare for my child, etc. When I accepted the position prior to my pregnancy, I was told by my boss, let's call her Ronnie, that it was very flexible as long as I got my hours in. I very rarely worked from home and typically only did so for an hour or two in the morning in order to work before OBGYN appointments, as it was a long commute between work and home and doctor's office. However, I was told by Ronnie after accepting the position to try and limit work from home to 2 days a month. Which, fine. At this point, I was well under, since I was only working an hour or two, maybe twice a month, and only once a month before that. Being so close to my due date, I was experiencing physical hardships that made working on site more and more difficult, such as dizzy spells, a pulled tendon in my foot, and severe back pain. I was also scared of potentially going into labor while at work, with it being so far away from the hospital my OBGYN delivers at. To top it all off, my coworkers started asking more invasive questions about my pregnancy that made me uncomfortable. All in all, it was not a fun time. I explained all of this in an email to Ronnie and asked for her permission to almost exclusively work from home up until I go into labor. I said I thought it would be a reasonable accommodation and I work really well from home. Ronnie responded a couple days later denying my request to work from home at all and said I needed to be there since we would be starting some of our busiest work in a couple months, which I would be gone for on maternity leave anyways, so I'm not sure why she brought it up. But I could talk to HR about leave options if I am truly having trouble working. By the way, it is illegal in my state to require an employee to take leave if there is a reasonable accommodation that can be made instead. Cue Malicious Compliance. I immediately went to HR and did just that. We talked about options and found out I could start my leave the very next day and still be paid state mandatory leave pay for the extra time. I informed Ronnie that I would be out starting the next day as I needed to take care of myself. She said, I understand you need to do what's best for you, but you need to understand that I need to do what's best for the team. So yeah, everything I normally managed basically went to crap in my absence, as the other people on the team weren't qualified to do the work and kept taking time off leading up to my due date instead of learning the basics while I was still there to teach them. I left detailed procedure notes and workflow lists, but later I found out Ronnie had to pick up all the extra work and a lot of it never got done since she didn't have time. But it was best for the team, right boss? Jumping down to the comment section on this one, we have one from a user called Pizza Lover. It says, sucks to suck. Good for you, OP. I'm glad you got some well-deserved paid time off to rest before the baby got here. OP responded and said, thank you. It ended up being extremely valuable time off for sure. For 2 weeks, then we had to induce. Laugh out loud. Another commenter down below called Frozen Flame 101 said, wait, you were expecting to be working 1 week before your due date? Is this normal where you are? I swear people here normally start pregnancy leave 3 to 4 weeks ahead of their due date. In part, I'm sure, because going into labor at work sounds like a great way to generate avoidable paperwork. OP responded and said, federally we have 12 weeks unpaid leave. I wanted to spend as much time as possible with my son before returning to work. My state has its own policy for partial paid leave, and I used all of my PTO to fill as much of the gap up as possible as well during my leave. HR helped me discover I could get 2 weeks extra for my pregnancy leave, which was separate from my maternity leave. I wasn't aware of it previously. The HR team rocked and kept me sane. Wait a minute, what do you mean, OP? An HR team that wasn't there to protect the company and was actually working for the employee? I don't believe it for a second. Truthfully though, sometimes there are really good HR people who are looking out for the employees. OP got extremely lucky that they're in a company where they have somebody who cares. This story comes to us from RVD90277, Working Hours. I guess I have a short story from the opposite angle. I was the manager and the malicious compliance person was one of the guys on my team. This was 10 plus years ago, and we were working at a software technology startup. It was a small company with only around 10 employees, and I led the software engineering team of around 4 employees. We hired a software engineer, and he seemed good, but there were a few red flags. We would go out to lunch, and he would always order at least a few beers. We didn't have any explicit rules against drinking alcohol during lunch, so I just let it slide, since it didn't seem to affect his work in the afternoon. And then, the guy started disappearing in the early afternoon. Hours were somewhat flexible, but most people would get into the office around 9 AM or so, and leave at around 5 PM or so, for a standard 40-hour work week, taking time off for lunch. It seemed relatively normal for most people, and we never had a problem with work hours in the past. But this guy would usually disappear at around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and was coming in at around 9 or 10 AM. I'm actually not really a stickler when it comes to enforcement of work hours, and I believe that as long as you get your work done, you should be okay. But as a startup, there was always stuff to do, and there was always a backlog of things to develop, etc. As a small team, we didn't have much redundancy, so guys would have questions for each other throughout the day, etc. It really did stand out as well, because since there were only 10 people in the company, the office space was pretty small. His absence was noticed by the CEO and other employees, etc. I asked him about his frequent early departures, and he just said that he had personal things to take care of sometimes, like doctor's appointments, dentist appointments, DMV to do something, etc. Just random errands. I told him that it's all good, and while we aren't tracking time by the minute or anything like that, we generally expect people to work roughly 40 hours a week, and hopefully that's not too unreasonable. I suggested that maybe if he has an appointment and needs to leave, say, 1 hour early, he can also choose to come in an hour earlier on that day, or he can choose to work a little later, like an extra hour, on another day, to roughly make it up. He made some comments about how he's never worked at a company so strict before when it comes to work hours, and that all of the other places where he worked never had an issue, etc. And sure enough, the next day when I came into the office, I was told that when the office manager came to unlock and open the office, he said that the guy had been waiting at the front door since 4 AM sitting there in the staircase because he was told that he needs to come in early if he's going to leave early. And since he was planning to leave at lunch, he came in 5 hours early. He gave notice shortly after that saying how unreasonable and strict we are, and he was gone a few weeks later. Maybe I was in the wrong here, but still seemed a bit odd at the time. For what it's worth, the whole come in a little early if you need to leave early thing seems to work even in my current companies, etc. Down in the comment section for this one, OP added on a bunch more information. It says, since there seems to be a little bit of interest in this post, I'll add some more follow-up info. Since this was a software startup, the dress code was very casual. Most employees wore just jeans and a t-shirt with sneakers to work. And I suppose if you were a little more dressy, you might wear khakis and a polo shirt and some nice leather loafers. This guy usually dressed in jeans, but on many of the days that he would leave early, he was dressed up in slacks, button-up shirt, etc. A few times, he even had a full-on suit. So we just obviously thought he was interviewing, and we even joked about that, and he said no, he just likes to dress up sometimes. We didn't believe him. But in tech, even when you interview, you usually didn't dress in a suit either. Sometimes you did, but it wasn't really a mandatory type of thing like other industries. After he gave notice, the employees were like, "Dude, you were totally interviewing when you were showing up dressed up." And he kept on insisting that he wasn't interviewing and he just liked to dress up sometimes. But since we were a startup without any redundancy, our CEO actually was not happy when he gave notice. CEO told me, "I talked to him and offered him a raise to stay, and he gave me his word that he'd think about it for a week before making any final decisions. So I think he's probably going to stay. Check back in with him in a week and let me know what he decides." A week later, I ask him, and the guy's like, "What? I gave notice last week. This is my last week." Our CEO was a bit delusional as well and had his issues. Such a shame, because it was kind of a fun place to work. I left about 6 months or so later. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, we have one from a user called Wife of Bath 1984. It says, "I do not at all believe that he's never had a job that was strict about hours before. I've been working for 25 years. The company I currently work for is flexible, like this company was. It's the first job I've had with such flexibility. He just sounds like a bad employee. He punished himself. Totally illogical." Another commenter down below called Locust Construction said, "Hope if someone called for references, you would say something like, 'He is really good at maximizing his time away from the office.' If asked if you were to hire him again, he would be our first choice to send a release of non-compete to." We're obviously only hearing OP's side of the story, and we don't have the side of the employee that thought that he was in a horrible workplace. I would say from what we know that OP got off really easy in this case, because this guy basically got rid of himself when he didn't like the way that things were going. That allowed OP to move on and get somebody else into that position. This story comes to us from Space Baron, new power tripping boss. This happened several years ago. At the time, I was working for a certain government organization that shall not be named. I worked office hours, which meant that our work hours were set. Our workday would start at 7:30 in the morning and continue until 4 p.m. in the afternoon. In between, we were allowed a 15-minute tea break from 10 to 10:15, lunch from 12:30 to 1, and then a coffee break from 3 until 3:15. Besides lunch, none of us ever worried about the tea and coffee breaks. We would get up from our desks and make yourself a cup of tea or coffee, and then drink that in between work. During lunch, our offices would be closed to the public, which was the normal, but some offices who did critical work would have at least one person there during lunch for emergencies. Those offices would remain open, and the members would take lunch at different times to accommodate the public. Although we were supposed to stay until 4 p.m., none of us ever did. Most of us would go and sign off at 3:45 p.m. and then go home. We figured that no one would mind since we never took our tea and coffee breaks. Then we got a new boss. For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened, and then we were ordered to stay until 4 o'clock. No more going home 15 minutes early. At first, we tried to fight it, stating that we never took our breaks as we should, but that was shot down very fast. So we decided that we were going to follow the rules no matter what. At 10 o'clock, all the offices would close for a tea break, no exceptions. The same would happen at lunch and again at 3 for coffee break. At exactly 4 p.m., we would all close our offices and leave for home. Anyone of the public still there? Sorry, come back tomorrow. Anyone of the public there during our breaks? Sorry, we can only help you after our break. Needless to say, everything that was running like a well-lubricated clock very soon started to fall apart. People started to complain, and if there is one thing in the government that is not tolerated, it is complaints from the public. Sabotage? No, we are only following the rules as we should. I'm not sure who got ripped a new one from upper management, but things very quickly returned to normal after a week of utter chaos, and our new boss never dared to power trip again after that. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, we have one from a user called Cackles. It says, "The last thing that a government agency wants is a pissed off constituent complaining to a politician who controls the agency's purse strings. Don't be the one who causes that to happen." Another commenter down below called Bada said, "Meh, I kind of understand the reasoning behind this one. You can't just decide to head off early because you chose not to take your break. The office is supposed to be available for the public during those hours. So if everybody decided to just up and leave early, it wouldn't be. Things like this need to be discussed and agreed before going ahead with it, in my opinion. Yeah, I wasn't really understanding how that worked myself. This is a government office, but yet they're allowing them to go home 15 minutes before the doors are even supposed to be closed? That makes no sense. I honestly think the new boss was just making sure they were there until the doors were supposed to be locked so that nobody was getting turned away if they came in 10 minutes before closing. This story comes to us from No Recording 6287. Know how much you can lift. Back in high school during my freshman year, I was on the football team. For my high school, if you were on the football team, you were required to have one weightlifting class, fall semester, per year, since the weightlifting coach was the football coach, and he could put you on a specialized training separate from the other students in the class. I normally train with one of my defensive end buddies since we lifted relatively close to each other, so most workouts we wouldn't have to change the weights after each set, and we could take a reasonable break between sets. One guy on the team, a backup cornerback, was usually way too cocky for his own good, always trying to show up his teammates. It's also important to note that he was about 50 pounds lighter than us and didn't do hardly any lifting. So one day, me and defensive end were going for our 1 rep max squats. I think at the time, we had about 225 on the bar. Cornerback walks over with a smug look on his face that had "I'm better than you" written all over it. He told us that it looked easy and that he could lift it no sweat. We told him it's definitely heavier than anything we've seen him lift. His confidence didn't falter though, he doubled down on his stance. Then he says to let him get one in. I look to defensive end. Defensive end looks at me. Okay, fine, go ahead. Do you want spotters? Nah, this is easy, I don't need your help. I look at defensive end. Defensive end looks at me. We took a step back and watched. To his credit, he was at least able to get it up off of the hooks and onto his shoulders. His legs were shaking though. He clearly was struggling, but he had very clearly said he could do it and he didn't want any help. So we didn't help him. Cornerback squat and didn't get back up. If there weren't guards to save him, he definitely would have been stuck there for a bit because defensive end and I were ready to not help him at all. Cornerback walked away embarrassed, and coach, who was apparently behind us when this whole thing happened, just laughed and told us, well, funny, to not do that again. Coach referenced that moment several times during the season, and thankfully cornerback was a good sport about it all. We were cool for the rest of the season. Opie added a really quick edit at the bottom. It says, edit to clarify, coach made it an unbreakable rule that no matter if you have spotters or not, you would always squat with bumper safeties under you. So when he squatted and got himself stuck, all he had to do was let go of the bar and roll forward. No need to wait for someone to help you, especially since the weight could be really heavy. The highest max I saw was 415, and many people only had one partner instead of two. There are so many videos of gym fails online where you see people go down and almost break their necks with the weights coming down on top of them because hardly anybody uses the safety features that are on their gym equipment, which is incredibly dumb because you're going to get seriously injured if you don't and something goes wrong. As far as cornerback in this story goes though, I think the embarrassment was on his shoulders and it might have weighted heavily. If you enjoy daily Reddit stories, I encourage you to follow and add us to the favorites on whichever podcasting platform you enjoy the most. Also, if you're watching and listening on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video. It really helps us out. I thank you for watching and listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.